All right, let's kick off. Welcome everybody to this webinar on Maximising Australia's green growth. I'm Purdy Bowden from the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, and I'll be your host today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the Wurundjeri country today here in Melbourne. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land that you're each joining from today. And I do this not because Australians need to be welcomed onto their own country, but to honour this tradition of our First Nations people, of recognising not just the rights but the responsibilities of custodianship in relation to country and the special connection that First Nations culture has in relation to land. And the topic we're discussing today of how to realise Australia's clean energy superpower ambitions has a deep connection with the interests of First Nations people and the quest for economic self-determination, because in many cases, the major projects that would underpin Australia's green transition will take place on Indigenous lands. It's not a topic that we're going to focus on today, but it's something that at ASFI we are working on, including through our support of the First Nations Project Group. And for those that are interested, there's a link to that organisation in the chat. For those of you who don't know ASFI, we are a member-based not-for-profit organisation committed to realigning the financial system to support a sustainable, resilient and inclusive Australia. Our work spans climate, nature and social wellbeing, and we're really focused on enabling the allocation of capital for positive impact across the economy and at scale. Now, Australia is an island country, but its economy and its future is deeply intertwined with the world beyond our shores. And so ASFI's work extends into the Asia Pacific and beyond. And over the past few months, we've been working with Kaya partners on a report that we're pleased to release today entitled Maximising Australia's Green Growth. And you can have a look at that report via the QR code on the screen or the link in the chat. This report tells a story that may be familiar to many of you and has certainly gained traction in recent years. It's a story of Australia's potential to become a clean energy superpower through the export of green commodities extracted and made in Australia, and a story of the risks that Australia faces if it fails to realise that potential. The report acknowledges the steps that the Australian government has taken recently to shore up this future through the Future Made in Australia agenda, which is really focused on the supply side measures, such as production tax credits. And it argues that more attention is now needed to the other half of the story, the demand side. And this is where international engagement really comes into play. It's through our foreign trade and development policy levers that Australia can start to provide confidence to investors and financiers that there will be markets ready to buy what Australia wants to sell. And the report canvasses a number of ideas for how we can use these levers more strategically. Joining me today, I'm really pleased to have Leila Parakin, partner at Kaya Partners, who produced this report for ASFI, Christian Haining, Director of Decarbonisation at Fortescue, Ryan Neelam, Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program at the Lowy Institute, and Kylie Turner, Systems Lead for Sustainable Economies at Climate Work Centre. We'll shortly have a panel discussion, and I encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function. But first, I want to invite Leila to step us through the key findings from the report. So over to you, Leila.
Thank you, Purdy, and it's an honor to be here. So as Purdy said, I'm Leila Parakin. I'm a partner at Kaya Partners. Just one quick word on who we are. We're an advisory firm focusing on the political economy of the transition, which means that we spend a lot of our time at the intersection of trade, industrial strategy, and climate policy. We're based our teams are based in London and in Copenhagen, but we operate globally and do a lot of work in Southeast Asia, but also in the US and in Latin America. It has been a true honor working with ASFI on this report. I want to start by saying that it's been a true collaboration, and the complementarity of our skills has been pretty crucial to delivering this report. As you probably noted by my introduction of Kaya Partners, we are Europe-based. And we have strong expertise in trade and climate finance, and we couldn't have written this report with ASFI's deep understanding of the Australian context. So it was a true collaboration, and we worked hand in glove to produce this report. I also want to say a big thank you to all the people who have contributed and helped us along the way, including some people on this panel today. So again, we couldn't have done it without you. And so big thank you to everyone who's contributed. So now let me jump straight into the slides and give you some of the highlights of the report. Thank you. So as Purdy said, it's still quite early morning for me, so you're going to have to forgive me. As Purdy said, everyone is very familiar with the story about Australia's clean energy potential, so I'm not going to dwell on that. What really the report puts the spotlight on is the challenge that Australia is about to face, and that challenge is going to grow in the future, especially as Australia's key trading partners start to move to implement net zero plans and eventually phase out fossil fuels. So that really puts at risk Australia's export revenues. The graph on the left-hand side of the diagram shows that coal, natural gas, and oil represent more than a quarter of Australia's exports, with a combined revenue of around 200 billion Australian dollars in 2023. And as I said, this export revenue in the long term is at risk given the direction of travel of Australia's key trading partners. In 2023, four of Australia's top 6 markets for coal exports, and that is Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India, saw declines in demand for coal. And the diagram on the right-hand side shows projected demand for coal and gas from Japan specifically in 2050. You've got more of these graphs for other countries in the report, but we just picked Japan here for sake of example. These projections are based on IEA and World Energy Outlook projections. And of course, some people might argue that these projections are highly uncertain. And that there is a margin of error, and this is why we have used the least ambitious IEA projections here, but nevertheless, it shows a clear trend, especially for coal. The story is a bit more complex for gas, as we know, but there are a few indicators that are quite telling here, such as declining prices of LNG contracts, high fixed cost of new LNG contracts, and the entrance of new players producing LNG at cheaper costs could impact the profitability of the Australian LNG industry down the line. So again, a more complicated story for gas, especially in the current context, but nonetheless also a long-term trend that seems quite clear. But of course, these challenges could be mitigated by adapting and seizing some of the opportunities, in particular in green sectors. Next slide, please. So before I jump into the opportunities, I just want to say a word about the current context, because of course, the trade war that is playing out as we speak is putting in question the pace of the decarbonization. And there's a lot of talk about fossil fuels should be around for longer and etc. I mean, regardless of that, I think as I said, the direction of travel is quite clear. It's really the pace of the decarbonization here that's in question. And at the end of the day, my view is that the situation will increase the opportunities for collaboration between countries outside of the United States. So there is here again a real opportunity for Australia to lean forward and position itself as a key provider of renewable energy and green commodities, and a key player in clean energy supply chains. And as Purdy pointed out, the Australian government has already taken very important steps, in particular with Future Made in Australia. But there is a lack of focus on the demand side. And of course, one might ask, what influence can Australia have on demand. But again, the current context, I think, calls for greater collaboration and greater dialogue between countries outside of the United States. So again, I think that now there is an opportunity really to lean on creating more demand and influencing the direction of travel of that demand, and create certainty around offtake, which is, of course, crucial for investors and to make sure money flows. And Australia has two levers to influence demand, and the first one is trade. So that brings me back to the graphs on this slide. On the left-hand side, we have picked the top trading partners of Australia: China, India, Japan, and South Korea. And here in purple, you can see that the total demand for clean energy by 2050. So that that's what the purple bar shows. The total demand for clean energy by 2050. Some of it is already filled by Australian products, and that's the blue bar. And the white bar shows how much more Australia could be doing to fill the gap. So you can see that there's huge potential there. On the right-hand side now, what you can see is that compared to other countries, the flow of FDI from Australia to ASEAN countries has been fairly low in absolute terms. You can see that most countries, especially US, Canada, China, and Japan, have ramped up their FDI in the region in the past few years, whereas Australia's has remained the same. That means basically that these countries are now more familiar, or their companies are more familiar with the business environment of these countries, and that gives them an edge. But of course, that hides an important reality for Australia, which is that Australia has quite unique and close diplomatic and cultural ties with the region, and that gives it a natural advantage. And so there is, again, lots of potential and opportunity there, but that would require strategies to be turned into concrete policies and actions, and with greater coordination across government to really push forward a trade and export strategy that's aligned with the development of green sectors in Australia. Next slide, please. Now, I want to focus on the second lever, which is climate finance. And of course, the climate finance has been an underutilized lever in Australia. And there are, of course, clear reasons to continue the current strategy and the current focus on climate finance in Australia on the Pacific region. So here we're not arguing that that has to change, of course. What we are arguing is that there's a real opportunity to ramp up climate finance in the Southeast Asia region, especially by aligning Australia's industrial strategy, trade, and climate finance objectives. This will require, once again, greater collaboration across government and greater coordination. And what we are recommending in a report is strong ownership at the center of government of such a strategy and its implementation. It will also require aligning climate finance with diplomatic efforts. And here I want to cite the example of the UK, where I used to work in the UK government on climate finance for years. So it's a topic I'm familiar with. And we created climate partnerships in the UK with strategically important developing countries. And we deployed a range of climate finance programs within these countries and promoted ownership from our ambassadors in post. So the team was centrally managed from London. We were recruiting the teams. We were then embedding them in posts to support the ambassadors, and the teams were then managed by both the team in London and our ambassadors in post. And that created a really powerful model that created greater ownership and combined the power of climate finance with diplomacy. And that delivered very positive impacts, meaning that the impact of all our programs in these countries became much, much larger than the sum of its parts. And another important recommendation we're making here is that in this report is that deploying climate finance can really be more transformational if you deploy technical assistance to create the right enabling environments alongside and in coordination with blended finance instruments. So that coordination between those two sort of more grants related instruments and blended finance instruments can also be very powerful, but it does require that the right institutional setting. And this has, that sort of approach has been adopted and implemented by Australia in the past, so it's nothing new. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I've included the example of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which has aligned trade and development objectives. And that has led to a doubling of Australia's climate exports to the Southeast Asian region. So again, it has been done before, and it's a matter of replicating and adapting to green sectors. Next slide, please. Now, to be more practical in this report and to bring some of our recommendations to life, what we have done is we have mapped out the opportunities for the Australian economy in key countries and key sectors. And I don't want to spend too much time going through this. There's more on this in the report, but you get the idea. This is basically a heat map of the opportunities. Green is, of course, where there's high potential, all the way to red, where the potential is lower. I'm very happy to discuss this in more detail with anyone who's interested. And of course, it's only a first cut, and it does require more digging. So please treat it as such. And we just wanted to make sure that we had an understanding of where the opportunities were, and as we were writing this report. Now, next slide, please. And I'm going to end on this slide, which basically sums it up. The leveraging trade and climate policy to serve Australian economic interests will ensure that Australia remains competitive internationally in the long term, while accelerating the green transition. I think that's a strong message from our report. And this long-term economic planning will have short-term benefits, and I think that's also an important point. It will provide greater diplomatic influence in the Southeast Asian region, but also greater recommendation by Pacific Islands, who are desperately looking for more climate leadership out there, especially in these difficult times where climate finance, and especially public finance, is shrinking. So I think there are really opportunities here for Australia to step up and show leadership. There are, of course, a lot of very good building blocks in place and to build from. So the focus on more action by government should be really to create new markets for Australian green products and promote Australian investments in the Southeast Asian region. So the foundations are strong. It's what we're arguing is to build on those foundations and expand. And finally, sitting in Europe, I can tell you that the feeling here every time we speak about Australia is that if Australia can't do it, who can? Australia is absolutely blessed with the resources required to have thriving green sectors. But to make this all happen, you do need political will and proactive strategies and more importantly, effective implementation. So yeah, lots of potential and exciting opportunities. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leila, and a great, I think, high note to end on for that presentation. And I think that's kind of set up and frame the discussion really well. There's a lot of important ideas in there, and I want to begin to unpack some of those in this discussion. As I said, for those who want more detail, please do go and download the report, but stay with us because we're going to get a bit more deeper. Kylie, I'm going to go to you first, and I want to kind of come back to the fundamentals. Because the renewable energy superpower promise and opportunity is premised on the idea that Australia can, as Leila says, can do it, that we can decarbonise our economy, including our mining sectors and our heavy industry, in particularly in areas like iron and steel. At the Climate Work Centre, you've done a lot of work looking into the feasibility of doing this in a way that's consistent with meeting the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So can you tell us, is it possible? And what is the sort of scale of the investment that's needed to make it happen?
I can tell you, Purdy, it is possible, but it's very challenging, as we know. Our work with the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative found that with strong ambition, coordinated action and government support, industry emissions could be reduced by 92% by 2050 based on 2020 levels, and that was in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It is possible. It's also challenging. It requires a transformational shift in Australia's energy system, and more than that, significant investment in abatement technologies, the cost of which could be as high as $625 billion by 2050. In the iron and steel pathway, which we've been taking a bit of a look at here, we found that it was possible to reduce emissions by 99% by 2050, and this would require a $19.5 billion investment in technology and energy, and that is to support the development and deployment of low emissions technologies alongside the unprecedented energy transformation. There is also, to Leila's point, the potential for growing industrial production and new export-oriented industries if Australia can leverage its renewable energy advantages. The Australian Industry ETI modelled the implications of dramatically scaling green iron production for export. So green iron produced using renewable hydrogen could be exported in large quantities to take advantage of both Australia's mineral and renewable energy resources. Establishing a green iron export industry in Australia would require an additional investment of up to $30 billion by 2050, but again in green iron technology investment. Australia's got a track record as a commodity exporter in iron ore, LNG, lithium more recently, and we can do the same with green products if we think about Australia's sunshine and wind as commodities and invest in them in the same way and collaborate across the economy to decarbonise both Australia and our region.
Thanks, Kylie. I think that's a really important point, that we're not, when you talk about renewable energy superpower, we're not exporting the energy directly. We are using our renewable energy to create value-added products here and then export those. And the person I think who is really well placed to speak to this is Christian Heinig. Christian Fortescue has staked a clear claim in the energy transition, committing to real zero emissions by 2030. So that's real zero emissions without relying on offsets in your mining operations. And you've got some well advanced plans for the production of green iron too. So I think there are those that doubt the kind of feasibility of producing green iron. As I'm interested how Fortescue views this challenge and opportunity, both for your business and for Australia more broadly. You're on mute, Christian. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for to share. Right? So yes, Fortescue is extremely excited about the opportunity, both for us in scope 1 and 2, which is the iron ore mining bit, as well as for us in scope 3, which is the iron making and steel making side of things. And if you go through in that order, so yes, you're right, we will get rid of all of our we are
Christian, we're not hearing you loud and clear, unfortunately. I know we were in our tech test, so I'm not sure if something's changed. We're getting you a little bit, but maybe if you're a bit closer to the mic, it might help.
Okay, is this better?
That's a bit better. It's still not great, but let's see how we go.
Well, then you'll have to see me really big then up close.
There we go.
Okay. So yes, I'll rewind. So we're working extremely hard already in getting rid of our emissions in our own iron ore mining. So by 2030, we will have replaced the equivalent of 1 billion liters of diesel in our mining operations with non-emitting alternatives. And we do that in a pretty harsh environment. So yes, Laila, Australia is blessed with a lot of renewable energy. It's also very remote. There's no grid and very harsh conditions. So there is some wins and some losses in that. But we are very excited about where we're going. And it's not only that we get rid of the emissions, but it is a profitable thing for us to do, right? So we save the planet and we save our wallet, so to speak, which is a great combination. We're now turning our attention into what is for us scope 3, which is the iron making side of things or the metal making side of things. And yes, it makes so much sense for Australia to stop exporting two separate commodities and combine them into one commodity. So to combine the iron ore and the energy that we export into green metals. We would say not quite to steel making because there's like over 3,000 different types of steel, and that is very specific to the local use. So the last bit you would still do locally in our view, but the base material in a case of like 95% iron products, we are better placed than almost every country in the world to do right here in Australia. And I would say right here in Western Australia, where the iron ore lives and where renewable energy lives. So it's a massive opportunity. I would also say it's an obligation because the world continues to need steel and big amounts of it. And there's no way that the world can meet its steel demand without getting steel from Australia also. So we cannot just ignore the Australian iron ores. It's too big to ignore. So we need to make green steel from Australian ores. And that is the pilot plant that we're building. This is not a plant producer, if I can be a bit pedantic here. We're actually building it again. We're spending money, we're spending effort. We're building a plant in the Pilbara, which will be operational this calendar year, that will dispel any remaining doubts that people might have whether the green iron making technologies that partially exist and partly are being developed work with the specific Western Australian ores. We are supremely confident. We've done all the tests. We just build a plan to show the rest of the world that it will. And that then opens up the world to use West Australian iron ores to make green metal. I think we would say, and we will do this ourselves in our own backyard. But even if it ultimately happens anywhere else, at least our ores are part of the journey. And if our ores are green, again, we're doing it, and we would suggest others in our neighborhood should do the same thing, then it's a completely green value chain. It's the mining is green and the metal making is green.
Thank you. And it's exciting. I think that demonstration effect of the first plant is incredibly important. And then the task is then to kind of scale and reproduce those manufacturing plants. And this is a hugely capital intensive exercise. So I'm interested in what you see as the role of government in supporting that investment that is needed to enable those industries to scale up.
Yeah, thanks. And yes, it's capital intensive. It's also profitable, right? So let's not start looking at this as a regrettable loss. No, it's a profitable business. But on your question, there's a few things that we are already working with both the state and the federal government on, and that we would continue to do before. So the one bit is help us get the plants built, right? So those are things like approvals, both on what is all levels of approvals. Let me not go into there, but getting approvals done swiftly and predictable would be a huge plus. There is a bit of R&D tax credit stuff there that is also helpful. And then the second big step is once we have the plant and we have the product, we obviously want to sell it and we want to export it. And both the federal and the state government have a proud history of helping commodity exports getting up and going over the past decades with LNG, with the original iron ore. So we would really want to kind of open that playbook again and say, let's do this again, as we did in the 80s with LNGs and in the 60s with iron ore. And so this goes into the territory of jointly working with, again, state and federal politicians to create this almost sovereign to sovereign understanding that we will produce stuff that other countries will then buy and finish, including the de-risking of it, the backstopping of it. That again was the bedrock of the earlier commodity export waves. Finally, I would be remiss in not mentioning that we think that the hydrogen production tax credit that the current government has put in place is extremely helpful, because not all, but many of the technologies that we will be using using hydrogen, and obviously having hydrogen at a competitive price makes all the difference.
Thank you. I think that's a great summary and kind of shows the suite of kind of factors that go into supporting this sort of industrial development to take place. And zooming in, I think, on one particular aspect that you briefly mentioned is that we know from ASFI members, from banks and investors, that offtake certainty is a really crucial way of managing the risk of financing investing in major projects. Pretty hard to justify that investment decision into a new project if you haven't identified and even locked in a purchaser for it. So, and when it comes to the production of green steel, you say it's possible here, but then the market in Australia is relatively small. And so we will be relying on demand from international steel producers for Australia's green iron or international purchase for green steel. Ryan, I want to come to you now, because as Leila has shown, Australia currently exports large quantities of fossil fuels and other raw commodities to our North Asian neighbours in particular, including China, Japan, Korea, India. And your work at Lowy Institute looks closely at the energy transition commitments and pathways and activities of these countries. So are they on board with Australia's renewable energy superpower agenda, and how can we work more closely with them, as Leila's indicated, to jointly transition that trade relationship?
Thanks, Purdy. It's a great question. Look, I think the short answer is we have a lot of convincing to do. The Australian government set out a broad ambition for our country to become a renewable energy superpower, but what we haven't done is articulate the detail about how we're going to get there and what that actually means for our bilateral relationships, our bilateral trading relationships. So our key trading partners haven't really decided whether to buy in or not, because we haven't articulated in clear terms what it means for them. Now, the government has been pretty clear at a high level what we want. Ultimately, we want to sell these green commodities, whether it's green metals, fuel, industrial goods. We want to stand up these industries that can eventually replace our fossil fuel exports and provide us with economic prosperity. But if this is going to work, we need to understand what our trading partners want, because they're the people that are going to buy this stuff, as you've said. And I think when you look at our major trading partners, often what you hear is the number one priority is energy security, particularly Japan and Korea. They want to know that an Australian fossil fuel phase out over time doesn't mean leaving them with the lights off. And when you look at Japan, which imports 90% of its energy needs, Australia is a huge supplier of energy to Japan. That's a significant consideration that we need to take into account. So I think to make the renewable energy superpower idea a reality, what we need to actually do as a next step is create diplomatic strategies with each of our major trading partners that provides at the first instance broad clarity on what our objectives are and what our timeline for that is. Secondly, that provides an answer to their energy security concerns and questions. And thirdly, engages them as partners that can share in the benefits of this renewable superpower journey. So it's not just about us, it's about us creating a shared future of economic prosperity together. Just to very briefly mention, Christian touched on the examples in the past where we've stood up industries. LNG in the 80s, of course, is a big one. There are precedents for this of doing joint industrial policy with trading partners. Japan in the wake of the oil shocks in the 70s, moved its aluminium processing offshore, where low-cost coal in Australia provided a competitive advantage for us to do that versus them. Now what we're looking at is the opportunity for us to do low-cost production of iron ore, iron for steel making, because of our renewable advantage. And the second part of it is the investment that we need to make that happen, which Layla set out in the introduction, and Kylie's also mentioned as well. If we work with Japan and we engage them as partners in this, what we could actually do is in the same way that Japan helped us create our LNG industry, we can actually create a new green iron, green commodities industry that benefits both countries and benefits from joint investment from both countries.
Thanks, Ryan. And I think you kind of hit on this tension between, yes, I think that there's clarity from both the Australian government and our partners in China and Japan of the end goal. But there's an uncertainty in how you make that transition and what the steps are to get there, and deepening that engagement and providing confidence that Australia will be there along the way, and that we can sequence this and synchronize it, and that we can and make the most of that kind of mutual benefit of investment into Australia and then export out of Australia to support decarbonisation in these countries is really important. I want to turn back to Layla and because we've kind of talked about North Asia and we talked about trade. Layla, you mentioned climate finance. And when we talk about climate finance, what we're really talking about is Australia's aid program, our development program, and the use of that in a way that supports decarbonisation and green industrial development in Southeast Asia in particular. We're talking about the main focus of Australia's aid program, which is Southeast Asia and the Pacific. In this context, where we're kind of zooming in on Southeast Asia. You've said it's an underexplored and underutilised lever in the renewable energy superpower discussion, and in Australia's toolkit. And you suggested that we can step into this. I want to just kind of come to a particular proposal in the report that Australia could benefit from a new financing mechanism, a new international financing mechanism in the form of an international bilateral green bank. And so the question I have is that Australia already uses grants. It already uses some blended finance, which is the combining of public finance to encourage and de-risk commercial finance and investment. We have our export credit agency now becoming more active in the region, Export Finance Australia, with a $2 billion new financing program. So why do we need something new?
That is a very good question, Purdy. And I guess that's the key here is the need for greater coordination across government, and also having the right skills to deploy this climate finance. So coordination across different ministries and different parts or different agencies of government is very important, because it aligns that strategic alignment that I was speaking about, and enabling that alignment of domestic industrial policy, trade, and climate finance objectives. Of course, it's much more harder to implement than the way I'm making it sound like it's nice and easy. But of course, it's not, as we know, and it does require the right institutional settings in government to do that. And for the sake of this report, we have looked and discussed quite in depth with Purdy and the ASFI team what institutional setups exist in Europe, and what we can learn from those for an Australian context, and how it can be applied to an Australian context. So what I would say is that the reason why we have recommended the creation of a sort of development finance institution is to really bring together and create alignment between some of the technical assistance endeavors, and making sure that those, so by technical assistance endeavor, I mean helping countries put in place the right policies to create new markets for green products, alongside the deployment of blended finance instruments. So the two reinforce one another. The blended finance targets demonstration projects that can bring in more investors and show how it can be done, and show that these projects are commercially viable, and that the policy environment is and the enabling environment is ready and ripe for these investments. Again, it's easier said than done, for sure. I mean, having worked on this for many years, it's very complicated, for example, to find the right projects to invest in. It's difficult to find the right level of risk. And that's exactly why you need people with the right skills and the right mindsets. So that's why a DFI, I think, would be or a sort of DFI, development finance institution, I think would be beneficial in this case, because it would support and help that greater strategic alignment. Now, I would say, I've worked a lot with export credit agencies in the past, and their skill set is very important for this discussion and needs to be at the table, but they don't tend to have the skill set to deploy more, higher risk taking blended finance instruments, and really go for these more demonstration projects that do require a slightly higher appetite for risk. And it's really trying to find this line between high risk appetite, but also demonstrating commercial feasibility. That's the trick here, and does require, again, I cannot repeat that enough, but that does require a very specific skill set that a development finance institution can nurture and create in the context of Australia.
Yeah, I guess the way we also think about it at ASFI is the difference between a deal taker and the ability to step in and just provide the large quantities of finance, which is something that export credit agencies can typically do, and some of them can do that in more innovative ways by the use of guarantees and other de-risking instruments, versus the deal maker. And that's the organisation that is specifically designed to get in there to do the project development and the feasibility studies and all of that preparatory work, potentially aggregating small projects and being there in that development phase to creating the kind of financial structures that then allow others to come in at that more developed stage and kind of over time bring in the commercial players. Christian, I want to kind of zoom in on a kind of another technical area that is canvassed on the report, which is the role that standards have to play in supporting this sort of industry. And I guess the kind of central idea is that it's all very well to say you're producing green iron, or green steel, but if nobody agrees on exactly what that means, then you're in a difficult world. And when it comes to ensuring access to your end market, where that's a green market and an market like the EU that will be introducing mechanisms like a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will have effectively tariffs for commodities that don't meet the same emissions standards as what is expected from domestically within the EU, then getting alignment all the way through the supply chain on those questions of what exactly is it that we are calling green steel is important. So a question for you is how important is this in the work that you're doing at Fortescue, and how do we get to that common understanding?
Yeah, so first of all, it is absolutely critical, not just for all the reasons that you mentioned, but also for the planet, right? Remember, we're doing this because we feel that CO2 needs to be reduced, or at least the CO2 emissions need to be reduced. And we absolutely need to be vigilant against greenwashing or efforts that seem to be green and they're not, right? So having stringent standards and having a good way to actually apply those standards is absolutely critical. Then second, of course, yes, from a financeability and from a practicality, from an industry perspective, having clear understanding what is what and having that clarity across borders again, is going to be very, very important. I would again go back to earlier days in the early parts of the 20th century. We did the same with oil, right? Oil is not a single chemical formula, and over time we trended towards gasoline and jet fuel and other kind of stuff. LNG, the same thing. So we need to do something similar for green commodities, not just green metals, but all green elements, where we have an international understanding of what is what. And we can then argue about price and that kind of stuff. So it's absolutely critical. Now, we do, of course, know that things are already happening. We welcome what the SV is doing with the Treasury to get those rules in place. It's very important for us, though, that this is not an Australian exclusive thing, but this becomes a bigger thing. Preferably worldwide, but at least with the major trading partners, as you lined out in the beginning. So maybe this could be part of the specific trading effort, but critical. But don't settle for green Nur steel or those kind of stuff. First of all, that is just not doing the planet any favors. But also, it then immediately invalidates us in Europe. You mentioned CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism. That is going to be very important. So our strong preference would be is to do something that is in line with, if not the same as, the standards that the European Union uses. And that when we say green steel, it is a substantial improvement. So not 10%, not 20%, not 50%, but at least 2/3, if not 3/4 CO2 reduction now. And then secondly, we would also support either yet the greenest steel or a standard that becomes stricter over time as more technology becomes available. But again, we cannot solve this at the Fortescue or as any individual industry. This has to be done on country level and preferably on region level, if not on economic bloc level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just highlights again the importance of Australia looking outwards and seeking to reach an agreement and harmonisation with other countries, and ideally a club of countries that becomes broader and sets the global standard, so that you are preserving integrity and as you say, not just getting access to markets, but doing what's necessary to keep those Paris goals in sight. You mentioned the work that we're doing with Treasury, and over the past couple of years, ASFI has been developing an Australian sustainable finance taxonomy, which doesn't define green steel. There's the important kind of underlying work to really get and knuckle down and settle on those definitions, but does seek to define and provide a common understanding, particularly across the finance sector for capital allocators, of what are the economic activities that are consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. So in the green iron, green steel, in the steel sector, efficiency measures in the intervening period in the next 5 years may be consistent with a pathway. You have the most efficient steel plant that there is. That's fantastic. But within 10 years, perhaps that's not enough. And actually what you need to be seeing is investments into a whole new kit that is genuinely moving towards zero carbon. We've now developed that for Australia. We've provided it back to the Australian Treasury, and we will release that later this year. I think what we're now really working on is supporting uptake of that within the Australian market, but recognising that there are 37 taxonomies, each producing their own common standard for what is green across the world, really proactively working with other countries and seeking to move towards, again, global harmonisation and a global standard for transition finance. And we're really excited to have recently kicked off a project with China doing exactly that. I want to move along and go to and come back to Ryan. Loe's been doing and does a lot of work on the importance of investing in renewable energy in Southeast Asia as a critical way to enable their own net zero ambitions. And they have, most of those countries have net zero targets. Australia also has important relationships to maintain in the Pacific. So my question for you is, can we do it all? Can we build those relationships right across the Indo-Pacific and maintain Australia's position as a partner of choice? And what does that look like?
Well, yeah, I think we have to do it all for different reasons. I mean, in Southeast Asia, that region is projected to contribute 25% of the growth in global energy demand to 2035. So that's significant. If Southeast Asia doesn't meet those energy needs through clean sources, it could send us backwards in a big way on the global climate agenda. In the Pacific, we have strong geopolitical interests there. We're a part of the region. We want to see the Pacific prosper, and any kind of failing in that front ultimately comes back to Australia as a key part of the region. And when the Pacific Islands look at the global climate change issue, I mean, they're the ones that have contributed the least, yet are also suffering some of the worst impacts of sea level rise and natural and climate-induced disasters. So on both sides, we need to kind of balance these things. But the good news is those agendas are complementary. You know, Australia it has had a focus in its foreign policy now of engaging more economically in Southeast Asia, and a big part of that, if you look at the Nicholas Moore report, which is about how we can lift our economic engagement in Southeast Asia, it's about the clean energy transition and the opportunities there for us. I think that report recognises that Australia could capture about $10 billion of the $300 billion per annum in revenues that are available through that Southeast Asian transition. So there's a big prize in it for us, and Australia has a lot to offer. We've got our resources, which will be critical in Southeast Asian production of batteries, for instance. We've got our talent, we've got our expertise when it comes to renewable grids. We're a lot further in the world along that pathway than many other countries are in the world. So we have something to offer there. So look, yeah, I think we do have to do all of those things. We have to walk and chew gum. And actually, if we win COP31, the bid to host the COP next year, that's the point where a lot of those agendas comes together, where we actually show our partnership to Southeast Asia and helping them with their energy transition. We show solidarity and support to the Pacific through adaptation and the mitigation agenda. And then we show our own kind of domestic transition progress and our ambitions to continue that.
Ryan, I'm really glad that you mentioned COP31, and I want to come back and get views from other panelists on this in a moment. But first, can I come to you, Christian, because there's a question in the chat that I think many people will be interested in the answer to, which is, do you see blue iron, so iron produced using LNG, as a realistic possible stepping stone to green iron, noting the relatively cheaper access to LNG in WA?
No, it will be my short answer. And let me say why. First of all, Fortescue and I personally don't really believe in spending quite a bit of effort in transition technologies that only do a smallish step, right? So if you move away from coal to natural gas, yes, it's a little better, but it's not an awful lot better. And you only, I would say, would really want to spend money on making a big step rather than a small step. So generally speaking, and whether this is true for green steel making or even for, say, demobilizing transport, completely different thing. Again, making diesel a little bit less bad is not nearly as good as getting rid of diesel altogether. So not really. And then if you talk about our ability to do steel making here ourselves, we don't have any steel making capability in Western Australia. We have very limited capability and capacity in the whole of Australia. So this is not going to address the fundamental point that we started with, which is protecting our large scale exports, because we would then need to construct new blast furnaces here using LNG, which just doesn't really make sense. Why would you build new technology and invest billions in I would say yesteryear technology? So by and large, no. Of course, if there's an existing blast furnace somewhere that still has a bit of life in it, and before you kind of scrap it and replace it with something else, you use either hydrogen or natural gas in order to make it a little bit less bad, yes. But is this going to be the big step that the world needs to get rid of emissions, or is it going to be the big step that's going to create an additional export market for us? No, not in our view.
Thanks. I think that's super clear. We've got a few minutes remaining. Kylie and Layla, I want to come to each of you with the question of the COP31 opportunity, and just to kind of explain a little, Australia has put its hat in the ring for hosting the UNFCCC climate conference in 2026. At the end of 2026, it's recently been announced that Adelaide would be the host city for that conference. Very exciting. I come from Adelaide, so that was quite good news for me. And we haven't got the bid yet, so we haven't locked that in. There is a competitor country in Turkey that is also seeking to have the rights. And of course we have an election on the weekend, and different views from the different parties about the value of hosting a COP. But assuming Australia goes ahead and is the host of COP31, Kylie, what do you think that opportunity lens is there for this renewable energy superpower agenda?
I think the first opportunity is for Australia to show what we can do as a country, and we've really started out on that path and can bed that down and use what we've learned to help light the path for others. That's probably the first one, but it's not the biggest one. The biggest ones, some of which we've already talked about today. So it's what we do in terms of climate financing, how we address adaptation and mitigation. But I think the biggest one for COP31 will actually be trade. There's a real opportunity in the current geopolitical environment, because it's a little bit more up for grabs than it has been previously, to reshape some of the relationships within the region, and to do that in service of decarbonising, so to get the kind of planet that is healthy and we can live on. And that COP31 is a real lightning rod for getting the kind of agreements that would support that. So it's a genuine opportunity to do better, but also to create the environment so others can do better, and Australia can support that too.
Yeah, so both using it as a catalyst to drive our domestic transition, but also to support global coordinated action. And Leila, I think you're going to have the last word on this. So looking forward to hearing what you say before we wrap. What's the COP31 opportunity, and how does that fit into this sort of context that you touched on earlier of the US stepping back, of even the UK in stepping back from its climate finance commitments, and in a really kind of understandable decision to redirect spending into defence budgets, and in this global context, what would Australia do with COP31?
Yeah, so for full disclosure, I used to be a UNFCCC negotiator, so I'm slightly biased on this. But as I think Kylie is absolutely right. I think one of the things that the UNFCCC has been trying to do, and that has been reiterated in previous COP decisions, is the need for the UNFCCC to play a bigger role in international collaboration and boosting that international collaboration. So I think the point you're making, Kylie, about using new opportunities and creating new dialogues around trade, greater collaboration around energy transition pathways between countries that are highly connected. There's so many opportunities that COP31 can bring. I think it will be really interesting to see what the Brazilians do this year, and what happens there. I agree with Kylie that trade is going to be very important. I think that of course, adaptation and loss and damage are going to be very contentious and challenging issues to discuss. But I think the other very, very challenging issue right now is climate finance. As Purdy said, the public finance is shrinking because of shifting priorities. It's a very difficult context. It really does undermine the trust between developed and developing countries. And so there's a real opportunity for Australia to step in and change the tone of that climate finance discussion, which is becoming more and more sour at the moment. So I think it will be a really defining moment for climate finance and changing the tone and showing that Australia is ready to step up. I think, as I said before, the COP will be jointly hosted with Pacific Islands, so the Pacific Islands are really looking for this greater climate leadership, and clearly I hope the situation changes in Europe, but not going to be Europe in the short term. So Australia can step up, really.
Thanks, Leila. And we're going to close because we're on time. And I think that the main message that I've heard today is that this opportunity won't be realised on its own, but it is an opportunity not just for Australia to shore up its future prosperity, but to support global decarbonisation and the interest that we all have in mitigating climate change and getting the world on track, but also to win friends in the Pacific and to support deeper engagement, deeper relationships with the Pacific and with Southeast Asia that would also contribute to kind of ongoing peace and prosperity in our region. So I want to say a huge thanks to all of our experts for your incredible insights. Thank you to everyone for joining today. Please go and download and read the report, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. So please take just a minute to complete a short survey, and the QR code is on the screen and link is in the chat. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.